Jonathan Whitmore was a man who had everything: money, success, and a life most people could only dream of. His journey to becoming a millionaire wasn't easy. Born into a modest family, he grew up watching his parents struggle to make ends meet. But Jonathan wasn't one to sit back and let life happen to him. From a young age, he worked hard, studied harder, and eventually built an empire from scratch. He invested wisely, took risks when others hesitated, and turned small opportunities into big successes. By the time he was 45, Jonathan owned multiple businesses, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, and all the luxuries that came with immense wealth. But despite having everything he ever wanted, Jonathan couldn't shake off a strange feeling of emptiness. As the years went by, he found himself growing more distant, not just from his family, but also from society as a whole. Living in a world where money talked louder than kindness, Jonathan began to wonder if people truly cared about each other anymore. Was it possible to find genuine goodness in a place where everyone seemed obsessed with appearances? These questions haunted him, especially late at night when the silence of his grand mansion felt almost suffocating. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Jonathan stumbled upon videos of social experiments. In one video, a wealthy man disguised himself as a homeless person to see how strangers would react. The results were eye-opening. Some people showed compassion, offering food or money, while others ignored or even mocked him. It made Jonathan think, what if he tried something similar? Could he learn something valuable about human nature by stepping out of his comfort zone? The idea fascinated him. For days, he mulled it over, imagining how such an experiment might play out. Finally, he decided to go through with it, but with a twist. Instead of conducting this test in some random part of the city, he would do it right outside his own mansion. What better way to observe the stark contrast between wealth and poverty than to place himself smack in the middle of it? He knew his neighborhood well. It was filled with affluent families who drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and lived behind high gates. They prided themselves on their status, but how would they react to seeing someone in need right outside their elite bubble? To pull off his plan, Jonathan needed to transform himself completely. No one could recognize him, otherwise the entire experiment would be ruined. So he rummaged through old boxes in his attic, searching for clothes he hadn't worn in decades. He found a pair of torn jeans, a faded jacket, and a ragged shirt that smelled faintly of mothballs. To complete the look, he added dirt streaks to his face and hands using mud from his garden. He even messed up his usually neat hair, letting it stick out in wild directions. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Gone was the polished millionaire, replaced by a scruffy beggar who looked like he'd been living on the streets for weeks. With his disguise ready, Jonathan grabbed a piece of cardboard and scrawled a message on it: hungry and homeless. It wasn't particularly creative, but it got the point across. He then dragged a tattered blanket outside and settled down on the sidewalk directly in front of his mansion's iron gates. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was sitting in the shadow of his own wealth, pretending to have none. Yet, as he sat there waiting for passers-by to notice him, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Would anyone stop to help him? Or would they simply walk past without giving him a second glance? As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, Jonathan braced himself for what was to come. Cars began driving by, their glossy exteriors gleaming in the morning light. A few joggers passed by, earphones plugged in, completely oblivious to his presence. Jonathan adjusted his position slightly, making sure his sign was visible. This, was it, the beginning of his experiment? Little did he know the next few hours would reveal truths about human nature that he never expected. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Jonathan sat patiently on the sidewalk, his makeshift sign resting against his knees. He tried to appear as inconspicuous as possible, blending into the surroundings like any other person in need. The first few passers-by barely gave him a second glance. A man jogging in sleek athletic gear sped past, his earbuds firmly in place, completely absorbed in his music. Another woman walking her dog tugged at the leash to steer clear of him, muttering something under her breath about strange behavior. Despite the indifference, Jonathan remained determined. He knew that patience was key if he wanted to observe genuine reactions. After about 20 minutes, a silver sedan slowed down near the curb. The driver, a middle-aged woman with oversized sunglasses, rolled down her window just enough to peer out cautiously. Her eyes flicked between Jonathan and the towering mansion behind him. She frowned deeply, clearly puzzled by the sight of a beggar sitting so close to such an extravagant property. Without saying a word, she sped off, leaving only the faint smell of burnt rubber in her wake. Jonathan sighed inwardly but didn't let it discourage him. Moments later, a group of teenagers strolled by, laughing loudly as they scrolled through their phones. One of them noticed Jonathan and nudged his friend, pointing toward the scruffy figure on the ground. They exchanged amused glances before one of them called out mockingly, "Hey buddy, maybe you should try selling your story online." The others burst into laughter, doubling over as they walked away. Jonathan felt a pang of sadness, but reminded himself that this was exactly why he was doing this experiment, to uncover how people truly reacted when confronted with someone less fortunate. Not all interactions were negative, though. About half an hour later, a young mother pushing a stroller approached cautiously. She looked tired, her hair tied back in a loose bun, and her clothes simple yet practical. As she neared Jonathan, she paused for a moment, studying him. Then, without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a granola bar. Kneeling slightly, she handed it to him with a warm smile. "Here," she said softly. "I hope this helps, even if it's just a little." Her kindness caught Jonathan off guard. For a brief moment, he forgot that he was pretending. He nodded gratefully, clutching the granola bar in his hand. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice hoarse from disuse. The woman lingered for a few seconds longer, her expression thoughtful before continuing on her way. Watching her leave, Jonathan felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for her compassion, but also guilt for deceiving her. The encounters continued throughout the morning, each one revealing a different facet of human nature. A delivery driver pulling up to the mansion stopped briefly to drop off a package. On his way back to the truck, he glanced at Jonathan and hesitated. Reaching inside his vehicle, he retrieved a cold bottle of water and placed it gently into Jonathan's cup. "Stay hydrated," the driver said with a quick nod before driving off. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the man's character. By mid-morning, Jonathan began noticing patterns in people's behavior. Some ignored him entirely, either too busy or too uncomfortable to acknowledge his presence. Others treated him with suspicion, as if his proximity to the mansion was somehow suspicious or staged. Still, there were those rare moments of unexpected kindness that made Jonathan question his assumptions about humanity. Each interaction added another layer to his growing understanding of how wealth, and the perception of it, affected people's attitudes. Around noon, a luxury SUV pulled up to the gate of the mansion. From where he sat, Jonathan recognized the car immediately. It belonged to his neighbor, Mrs. Harrington, a well-known socialite who hosted extravagant parties every weekend. Dressed in designer sunglasses and holding a designer handbag, she stepped out of the vehicle with an air of superiority. Upon spotting Jonathan, her lips curled into a sneer. She marched over to him, tapping her expensive heels against the pavement. "What are you doing here?" she demanded sharply, her tone dripping with disdain. "This is private property. You shouldn't be loitering around like this." Jonathan kept his head bowed, avoiding eye contact. "Sorry, ma'am," he murmured, keeping his voice low and gravelly. "Just trying to get by." Mrs. Harrington scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Get by? Please. You're ruining the aesthetic of this neighborhood. I'm calling security." With that, she whipped out her phone and began dialing furiously. Jonathan watched silently as she stormed back to her car, slamming the door shut behind her. He couldn't help but chuckle quietly to himself. Her reaction was predictable, almost comical, but it reinforced what he already suspected. Privilege often bred a lack of empathy. Amidst the sea of varied responses, one particular encounter stood out. A young boy, no older than 10, wandered, up to Jonathan clutching a small toy car in his hand. His parents trailed behind him, chatting animatedly on their phones. The boy tilted his head curiously, staring at Jonathan with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Jonathan smiled faintly, touched by the child's sincerity. "I'm fine, kiddo," he replied. "Just having a tough day." The boy hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. Holding it out shyly, he said, "Here. This might help." Jonathan's heart swelled with emotion. He shook his head gently. "That's very kind of you, but I can't take your money," he said. The boy's face fell slightly, but he nodded and returned to his parents, who hadn't even noticed the exchange. Watching the family walk away, Jonathan realized that perhaps the purest form of kindness came not from adults burdened by societal expectations, but from children untouched by cynicism. As the hours ticked by, Jonathan continued observing and reflecting. Every smile, frown, or dismissive glance told a story. Some people walked past with indifference, while others went out of their way to offer help, however small. Each interaction painted a vivid picture of human nature, highlighting both its flaws and its beauty. By the time afternoon arrived, Jonathan had collected more than just spare change and snacks. He had gathered invaluable insights into the complexities of compassion, judgment, and privilege. And though the experiment was far from over, he already knew that it would leave a lasting impact on him. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the sidewalk where Jonathan sat. The air grew warmer, and beads of sweat trickled down his forehead beneath the dirt smudges. Despite the discomfort, he remained steadfast in his disguise, observing the world around him with a mix of curiosity and quiet introspection. Just as he was beginning to wonder if anyone else would approach him, the familiar sound of tires crunching against gravel caught his attention. It was Eleanor, his wife, pulling into the driveway in their sleek black SUV. Eleanor Whitmore was every bit the picture of elegance. Dressed in a tailored blouse and designer jeans, her hair styled perfectly, she exuded confidence and poise. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. At first, she didn't notice Jonathan sitting near the gate. Her focus was on retrieving some shopping bags from the trunk. But as she turned toward the house, her gaze landed on the disheveled figure slouched on the sidewalk. Her eyes widened in surprise, followed quickly by irritation. "What on earth is going on here?" she snapped, marching over to Jonathan with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her voice carried an edge that made even passers-by glance curiously in their direction. "Who are you? And why are you sitting outside my property?" Jonathan kept his head bowed, careful not to meet her gaze directly. His heart raced, not because he feared being discovered, but because he dreaded seeing how far removed his wife had become from the compassionate woman he once fell in love with. In a raspy tone, he muttered, "Sorry, ma'am. Just trying to get by." "Get by?" Eleanor repeated incredulously, throwing her hands up in frustration. "This is private property. You can't just sit here like this. Do you have any idea how ridiculous this looks? People will think we're harboring vagrants." Her voice dripped with disdain, each word cutting deeper than Jonathan anticipated. He felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her rant. "You need to leave. Now," she continued, pulling out her phone. "If you don't, I'm calling security, or maybe the police, whatever it takes to get rid of you." Jonathan wanted to say something, to reveal himself right then and there, but he held back. He needed to see this through. Instead, he simply nodded meekly and shifted slightly, pretending to be intimidated. Eleanor huffed loudly, muttering under her breath about unbelievable nerve, before storming inside the mansion, leaving behind a trail of frustration. Watching her disappear through the front door left Jonathan feeling hollow. He had always known Eleanor valued appearances, but hearing her dismiss him so coldly hit harder than expected. Was this what years of wealth and privilege did to someone? Did they lose sight of basic human decency? He shook his head slowly, trying to push away the sadness creeping into his thoughts. This experiment wasn't just about testing others, it was also about understanding himself and his own life choices. Just as Jonathan began to settle back into his role as the beggar, another figure emerged from the mansion. It was Alex, his teenage son. Unlike Eleanor, Alex moved cautiously, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. He had clearly heard his mother's tirade, and now stood at the doorway, staring intently at the scruffy man on the sidewalk. For a moment, Jonathan worried that Alex might recognize him despite the disguise. But then, to his relief, Alex approached him hesitantly, clutching a crumpled $20 bill in his hand. "Hey, Alex started, his voice uncertain. "I don't know if this helps or anything, but here." He extended the bill toward Jonathan, avoiding eye contact. There was a nervous energy about him, as though he feared judgment for offering help. Jonathan looked up, meeting his son's gaze for the first time. Beneath the layers of teenage awkwardness, he saw something remarkable. Empathy. It was raw and unpolished, but it was real. Jonathan's chest tightened with pride. Without saying a word, he accepted the money, nodding gratefully. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Alex gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before retreating quickly back into the house. As soon as Alex was gone, Jonathan let out a heavy sigh. The contrast between Eleanor's reaction and Alex's couldn't have been starker. Where Eleanor had shown anger and impatience, Alex had offered kindness, even if it came with hesitation. It made Jonathan reflect on the values he and Eleanor had instilled in their son. Had they succeeded in teaching him compassion despite the trappings of wealth? Or was Alex's act of generosity a natural instinct, untainted by societal expectations? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of similar encounters. A landscaper working in a neighboring yard stopped by to offer a sandwich wrapped in foil. A group of teenagers mocked him, tossing empty soda cans in his direction. An elderly woman walking her dog paused to lecture him about finding a job instead of begging. Each interaction added another layer to Jonathan's growing understanding of human nature. Some people were cruel, others indifferent, and a select few radiated kindness. Yet, none of these reactions prepared him for what happened next. As the golden hues of late afternoon bathed the neighborhood, a sleek sports car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Richard, a former colleague of Jonathan's whom he hadn't seen in years. Richard was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight. He walked with purpose, his briefcase swinging rhythmically at his side. When he noticed the beggar sitting near the mansion, he slowed down, his brow furrowing in thought. For a long moment, Richard simply stared at Jonathan. Then, without warning, he knelt down beside him, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he studied the man's face. "You look familiar," Richard said finally, his tone cautious but curious. "Have we met before?" Jonathan froze. Of all the people, who could have recognized him? Richard was perhaps the last person he expected. They had worked together briefly during the early days of Jonathan's business career. Back then, Richard had been ambitious, driven, and full of potential. But somewhere along the way, life had dealt him a harsh blow. Rumors circulated that he had lost everything: his job, his savings, even his family. Seeing him now, dressed so impeccably, sparked a flicker of hope in Jonathan's mind. I don't think so," Jonathan replied gruffly, keeping his voice low to maintain the disguise. "But thanks for stopping." Richard tilted his head, still studying him intently. "Your eyes, they remind me of someone I used to know. A guy named Jonathan Whitmore. Ever heard of him?" Jonathan swallowed hard, fighting the urge to laugh at the irony. "Yeah, I've heard of him," he said carefully. "Rich guy. Lives around here, doesn't he?" Richard chuckled dryly. "Used to live around here, not sure what he's up to these days, but enough about him. What's your story?" And just like that, the two men struck up a conversation. Richard spoke openly about his struggles, how He had fallen on hard times after being laid off. How difficult it was to find work at his age and how lonely life had become. Jonathan listened intently, his heart aching for the man who had once been so full of promise. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Richard confided in him about his belief in helping others, even when he had little to give himself. "I may not have much," Richard admitted, "but I try to remember that everyone's fighting their own battles. If I can make someone's day a little easier, even in a small way, then maybe I'm doing something right." Those words struck a chord deep within Jonathan. Here was a man who had lost nearly everything, yet still clung to the idea of kindness. It was humbling and inspiring. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, Jonathan realized that this experiment had taken an unexpected turn. What started as a simple test of human nature had evolved into something far more profound. And as he sat there listening to Richard, he knew the most impactful part of his journey was yet to come. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, signaling the approach of evening, Jonathan found himself deeply engrossed in his conversation with Richard. The two men sat side by side on the sidewalk, their worlds colliding in a way neither had anticipated. Richard's openness was disarming. He spoke freely about his struggles without shame or bitterness, painting a vivid picture of resilience despite life's hardships. For Jonathan, it was both humbling and eye-opening. Here was a man who had once been a peer, someone he had worked alongside years ago, now reduced to fighting for scraps in a world that often overlooked people like him. Jonathan listened intently, nodding occasionally as Richard recounted his journey. After losing his job, Richard had spent months applying for positions only to face rejection after rejection. "It's not easy getting back on your feet when you're over 50, Richard said with a sigh. "Companies want fresh faces, younger energy. They don't care about experience anymore." His tone wasn't bitter, but matter-of-fact, as though he had accepted the reality of his situation. Despite everything, Richard still clung to hope. He told Jonathan about the odd jobs he took to make ends meet, delivering packages, cleaning offices, even mowing lawns for neighbors. "I've learned to adapt," he said with a wry smile. "You do what you have to do to survive. But sometimes I wonder if anyone notices. Does anyone really care?" Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to tell Richard that yes, someone did notice, that he cared deeply about what Richard was going through. But he couldn't, not yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, choosing his words carefully. "Do you think things will get better?" he asked, his voice soft but sincere. Richard shrugged, staring off into the distance. "Maybe, maybe not. I've stopped trying to predict the future. All I can do is keep moving forward and hope for the best." Their conversation shifted naturally to broader topics: family, dreams, regrets. Richard admitted that one of his biggest mistakes was letting pride get in the way of asking for help when he needed it most. "I always thought I could handle everything on my own," he confessed. "But life has a way of teaching you that no one is truly self-sufficient." Hearing this struck a chord within Jonathan. How many times had he acted out of pride, refusing to show vulnerability? How often had wealth insulated him from the struggles others faced daily? As Richard spoke, Jonathan realized how much he had taken for granted, not just material comforts, but also the support systems that had helped him succeed. Success wasn't built alone. It was nurtured by mentors, colleagues, friends, and family. Yet here was Richard, navigating life's storms without a safety net. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Jonathan. He glanced at Richard, studying, the lines etched into his face, the result of sleepless nights, stress, and years of hard work. There was wisdom in those eyes, a quiet strength that commanded respect. And then, almost instinctively, an idea began forming in Jonathan's mind. It started small, a flicker of inspiration, but quickly grew into something bigger. What if he could change Richard's life? Not out of pity, but as a gesture of gratitude for the lessons Richard had unknowingly imparted. "Richard," Jonathan began hesitantly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "What would you say if someone offered you a fresh start, a chance to rebuild?" Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but skeptical. A fresh start sounds nice, sure, but opportunities like that don't come knocking twice, especially for guys like me. Jonathan pressed on, his heart pounding with anticipation. Let's say, hypothetically, someone believed in your potential, someone who saw value in your experience and drive. Would you take it seriously? Richard chuckled softly, shaking his head. You sound like a motivational speaker. Look, I appreciate the pep talk, but let's be real. No one's lining up to hire a guy my age with a spotty resume. That's where you're wrong, Jonathan replied, his voice firm now. Experience matters more than you think, and determination. That's worth its weight in gold. For a moment, Richard simply stared at him, searching for sincerity in Jonathan's eyes. Finally, he sighed and said, If you're serious, then prove it. Show me this magical opportunity you're talking about. Jonathan hesitated, knowing the time had come to reveal himself. This was the moment he had been building toward all day, a chance to bridge the gap between privilege and hardship, to show that kindness and opportunity weren't reserved for the elite. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up, brushing dirt off his tattered clothes. Richard watched curiously, unsure what to expect. With steady hands, Jonathan removed the wig that concealed his neatly trimmed hair. He wiped away the smudges of dirt from his face, revealing sharp features softened by years of success. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Richard's, and for the first time there was no disguise. My name is Jonathan Whitmore, he said, his voice calm but resolute. And I'd like to offer you a position at my company. Richard blinked, stunned into silence. For several seconds he simply stared at Jonathan, processing the revelation. Then slowly recognition dawned on his face. Wait, you're that Jonathan Whitmore? The millionaire? The guy everyone talks about? Jonathan nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Guilty as charged. But why? Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Why would you offer me a job? You don't even know me. I know enough, Jonathan replied. I see someone who hasn't given up even when life handed you lemons. I see resilience, integrity, and a willingness to work hard. Those are qualities I value more than anything else. Tears welled up in Richard's eyes, unshed but brimming with emotion. I don't know what to say, he stammered. This is incredible. There's no need to decide right now, Jonathan assured him. Take some time to think about it. But know this. I'm serious. I believe in second chances, and I believe in you. The gravity of the moment hung in the air, palpable and profound. Around them, the neighborhood continued its usual rhythm, cars driving by, children playing in yards. But for Jonathan and Richard, time seemed to stand still. In that instant, barriers crumbled, and two lives intertwined in a way neither could have predicted. As dusk deepened, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, Jonathan extended his hand to Richard. Welcome back, old friend, he said warmly. Richard hesitated for only a fraction of a second before gripping Jonathan's hand firmly. It was a handshake filled with promise, trust, and the potential for renewal. Little did they know, this act of compassion would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their own. But for now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experiment had started as a test of human nature, but it had become so much more, a reminder that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in the ability to uplift others. And as he looked at Richard, tears glistening in his eyes, Jonathan knew he had made the right choice. The revelation of Jonathan Whitmore's true identity sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. As word spread about the millionaire who had disguised himself as a beggar, curious onlookers began to gather around the gates of his mansion. Some had witnessed parts of the day's events. Others had merely heard whispers and rushed over to see for themselves. By the time Jonathan stood up to reveal himself to Richard, a small crowd had formed, murmuring in disbelief. Jonathan turned to face the growing audience, his expression calm but resolute. He knew this moment was crucial, not just for him, but for everyone watching. This wasn't just about exposing his experiment. It was about sparking a conversation that would challenge how people viewed wealth, privilege, and compassion. Karingdao. A deep breath, he addressed the crowd directly. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "I'm sure many of you are wondering what's going on here today. Let me explain." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces before him. There were neighbors he recognized, some with raised eyebrows, others with arms crossed defensively, and strangers whose curiosity had drawn them closer. Among them was Eleanor, standing near the edge of the driveway, her jaw clenched tightly. Alex hovered behind her, his eyes wide with astonishment. "For years," Jonathan continued, "I've lived in this house, surrounded by luxury and comfort. But lately, I've felt disconnected. From my community, from humanity itself. I started asking questions. Do we truly see each other? Do we care about those less fortunate? Or do we simply look away because it's easier? So, I decided to find out." He gestured toward the tattered blanket and cardboard sign still lying on the sidewalk. "Today, I pretended to be someone I'm not, a homeless man in need of help. And let me tell you, the responses I received were revealing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some looked guilty, while others shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan pressed on, his tone firm, yet compassionate. "Some of you walked past without a second glance. Others mocked me, called security, or complained about my presence ruining your view. But there were also moments of kindness, people who stopped to offer food, water, or even a few kind words." His eyes landed briefly on the young mother who had given him a granola bar earlier that morning. She stood at the back of the group, clutching her child's hand, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Jonathan nodded at her warmly. "To those of you who showed compassion, thank you. You reminded me that goodness still exists even in a world obsessed with appearances." Then, he turned his attention to Eleanor, his wife. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of anger and shame flickering across her features. Jonathan didn't shy away from addressing her directly. "Eleanor," he said gently but firmly, "you told me to leave. You threatened to call the police, because I didn't fit into your idea of perfection. Does that make you proud?" The crowd gasped audibly. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, unable to form words. For once she seemed speechless. Jonathan softened, his tone slightly, knowing this moment wasn't about shaming her but encouraging growth. "We can't control everything around us, Eleanor. Sometimes life throws challenges our way that force us to reevaluate what truly matters. Today, I learned that kindness is more valuable than any material possession." Turning back to the crowd, Jonathan shared the story of Richard, the former colleague who had fallen on hard times but never lost hope. He explained how their conversation had inspired him to extend an olive branch, offering Richard a job and a chance to rebuild his life. "Richard reminded me that everyone has value," Jonathan said, motioning for Richard to step forward. "Regardless of where they come from or what they've been through, every person deserves dignity and opportunity." Applause erupted spontaneously, breaking the tension in the air. People clapped and cheered, some wiping tears from their eyes. It was clear that Jonathan's words had struck a chord. Even Eleanor, though visibly shaken, couldn't deny the power of his message. Alex, standing beside her, beamed with pride, clearly moved by his father's actions. But Jonathan wasn't finished yet. He wanted to leave the crowd with something tangible, a call to action that would inspire lasting change. "This experiment wasn't just about me," he said, raising his voice slightly to ensure everyone could hear. "It was about all of us. We live in a society that often prioritizes wealth over humanity, but it doesn't have to be that way. Each of you has the power to make a difference, to look beyond appearances and see the person underneath." With that, Jonathan announced the creation of a new foundation aimed at supporting individuals facing financial hardship. The foundation would provide resources, training, and employment opportunities to help people like Richard get back on their feet. "No one should have to struggle alone," Jonathan declared. "Together, we can create a community built on empathy and understanding." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Several neighbors approached Jonathan afterward, eager to learn more about the foundation and how they could contribute. One woman offered to host a fundraiser, while another volunteered her skills as a career counselor. Even Eleanor, though hesitant at first, eventually joined the discussion, her icy demeanor melting slightly as she listened to Jonathan's vision for the future. As night fell and the crowd dispersed, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the day's events. What had started as a simple social experiment had transformed into something far greater, a catalyst for change within his community. He glanced at Richard, who now stood confidently by his side, shaking hands with well-wishers. Then he looked at Alex, who gave him a thumbs up, his youthful optimism shining brightly. Finally, he turned to Eleanor, who met his gaze with a mixture of regret and admiration. "We still have work to do," Jonathan said softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "But today was a good start." Eleanor nodded slowly, her defenses finally crumbling. "You're right," she admitted. "I've been so focused on appearances that I forgot what really matters. I'm sorry." Jonathan smiled, pulling her closer. "So am I. But together we can fix it." Under the glow of the streetlights, the Whitmore family stood united, not as symbols of wealth and privilege, but as advocates for kindness and compassion. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jonathan knew they were moving in the right direction. And as he gazed at the faces of those who had gathered to witness his experiment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. True wealth, he realized, wasn't measured in dollars and cents. It was found in the connections we forge and the lives we touch. The days following Jonathan Whitmore's bold experiment brought a wave of change that rippled through the neighborhood and beyond. News of his social experiment spread quickly, fueled by social media posts, local news coverage, and word of mouth. People were fascinated by the millionaire who had disguised himself as a beggar to test humanity's compassion. Some praised him for sparking important conversations about privilege and empathy, while others criticized his methods, calling it a publicity stunt. But regardless of the opinions swirling around, one thing was undeniable. Jonathan's actions had ignited something powerful, a collective desire to reflect on how we treat each other in a world increasingly divided by wealth and status. For Jonathan, the aftermath of the experiment became a turning point, not just in his personal life but also in how he chose to use his influence. He threw himself into building the foundation he had announced that evening outside his mansion. Named the Whitmore Initiative, the organization focused on providing resources and support to individuals facing financial hardship. From job training programs to mental health counseling, the foundation aimed to address the root causes of poverty rather than simply offering temporary fixes. Jonathan worked tirelessly alongside Richard, who accepted the job offer and quickly proved himself invaluable as a mentor and advocate within the organization. Richard's journey was nothing short of transformative. With Jonathan's help, he regained not only financial stability but also a sense of purpose. For years, Richard had felt invisible, like society had forgotten about him. But now, standing side by side with Jonathan at community events and workshops, he realized that his struggles hadn't been in vain. They had shaped him into someone capable of inspiring others. Together, the two men traveled across town, sharing their story and encouraging people to look beyond stereotypes and assumptions. Their partnership became a symbol of hope, a reminder that second chances could lead to meaningful change. At home, Jonathan's relationship with Eleanor underwent a profound shift. The initial shock of discovering her husband's disguise had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. She had always prided herself on maintaining appearances, ensuring that their family projected an image of perfection. But after witnessing the raw emotions and reactions sparked by Jonathan's experiment, she began to question whether that perfection was worth the cost. Slowly but surely, Eleanor started opening up, to Jonathan, to Alex, and even to the community she had once kept at arm's length. One of the first steps Eleanor took was volunteering at the Whitmore Initiative. At first she hesitated, unsure if she belonged in such a setting. But as she spent time helping organize fundraisers and speaking with beneficiaries of the program, she discovered a new sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about making a difference no matter how small. Seeing the gratitude in people's eyes reminded her of what truly mattered. By the end of the month, Eleanor had become one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers, using her organizational skills to streamline operations and attract more donors. Alex, meanwhile, flourished under his father's guidance. Watching Jonathan step out of his comfort zone inspired the teenager to think critically about his own values. He began volunteering at local shelters and food banks, often dragging his friends along to join him. To Jonathan's delight, Alex developed a passion for social justice, frequently engaging in discussions about inequality and ways to create positive change. It was during one of these conversations that Alex suggested hosting a youth-led charity event, a concert featuring local bands with all proceeds going to the Whitmore Initiative. The idea took off, drawing hundreds of attendees and raising thousands of dollars. For the first time, Jonathan saw his son not just as a boy but as a future leader. As weeks turned into months, the impact of Jonathan's experiment continued to grow. The Whitmore Initiative expanded its reach, partnering with schools, businesses, and nonprofit organizations to tackle systemic issues like unemployment and housing insecurity. Local leaders began citing Jonathan's story as proof that individual actions could spark widespread change. Even critics who had initially dismissed the experiment as self-serving came around, acknowledging the tangible results it had produced. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred within Jonathan himself. The experiment had started as a way to answer questions about human nature, but it ended up teaching him far more about himself. He realized that wealth wasn't just a tool for personal gain, it was a responsibility. True success wasn't measured by the size of your bank account or the grandeur of your mansion. It was defined by the lives you touched and the legacy you left behind. By stepping outside his privileged bubble, Jonathan had rediscovered the joy of connection, the simple act of seeing and being seen. On a crisp autumn morning several months later, Jonathan stood on the steps of his mansion, overlooking the bustling activity below. Volunteers bustled in and out of the newly renovated community center adjacent to his property, carrying boxes of supplies and greeting visitors with warm smiles. Children played in the courtyard, laughing and chasing each other, while adults gathered in small groups, sharing stories and advice. It was a scene of unity and purpose, one that filled Jonathan with pride and gratitude. Eleanor approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. Handing one to Jonathan, she smiled softly. "You did this," she said, gesturing toward the lively scene before them. "All of it." Jonathan shook his head, sipping his coffee. "Not me alone," he replied. "This is the work of everyone who believed in the vision, including you." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears, but they were tears of happiness this time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me what really matters." Behind them, Alex called out, "Dad, Mom, come check this out." The two turned to see their son proudly showing off a mural painted by local artists, a vibrant depiction of hands reaching out to lift each other up. Beneath it, the words, "Together we rise," were emblazoned in bold letters. It was a fitting tribute to everything they had accomplished together. As Jonathan wrapped an arm around Eleanor and walked toward Alex, he felt a deep sense of peace. The emptiness that had once haunted him was gone, replaced by a renewed purpose. He knew challenges lay ahead. There would always be obstacles when trying to make the world a better place. But he faced them with unwavering optimism. After all, he had witnessed firsthand the power of kindness, resilience, and second chances. And so, as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over the thriving community he had helped build, Jonathan Whitmore reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What had started as a single day of pretending to be a beggar had blossomed into something extraordinary, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In giving others a chance to rise, Jonathan had risen too, finding a deeper meaning in life than he ever thought possible.